And now I'd just like to introduce our chair. Janine Miller is the Director of Libraries here at the Law Society. In 1982, she founded Miller & Fisher Consultants, a library consulting firm which provided services to clients on a contract or ongoing basis. She was Director of Library and Information Services at the law firm Mary Demers from 1994 to 96, and consulted to the firm for the following 8 years. In October 1996, she was appointed Director of Libraries for the Law Society of Upper Canada. Please help me welcome Janine Miller.
Well, on behalf of the great library staff who are going to do the morning session, we welcome you here. I will introduce the two speakers shortly. We're glad to see such a large turnout, particularly glad that people are interested in knowing how to do research properly. That is always a concern for library staff, that many people have to do research but really have no idea how to go about it or what they're doing. So the fact that people want to learn and want to know how to do it well is very important. I also right now have to apologize to you because although I'm supposed to be chair, I am actually going to be leaving as soon as I turn the podium over to Theresa and Jeanette. I have to attend a really important meeting on copyright this morning. And that is a very big issue for us as librarians and for anybody who is doing research and making photocopies. So it's sort of relevant to this, and I apologize for not being here for the rest of the morning. I hope to be back later on. Copyright is certainly an issue about which everybody should be thinking. We are at that stage with the legislation where it hasn't been defined what we can copy and when we can copy it. And this meeting is partly to deal with some issues around licensing and what we may and may not copy. I'd like to, just before we start, so we get a sense of where everybody is on the legal research road. First of all, who's in a large firm, and I'll identify that as over 50 people. Just a show of hands so we get a sense. Okay, between 10 and 49, and less than 10. Okay. In the group of less than 10, how many of those firms do not have articling students? Okay. And how many of you are independent legal clerks, in other words, not attached to a law firm at all? Okay. I guess you're here because you felt somewhat intimidated when you were asked to do legal research, not quite sure where to go, where the right place is. Technology has certainly changed how we do research and the practice of law, following on from that. So now instead of just going to the books and having a pretty clear understanding of which books are used for which purposes, you now have to make choices between print, CD-ROM, online, such as QL, LexisNexis, online databases, and now the internet has come into the picture. And that makes it very difficult to know how far one should go and when to stop doing research. And when to stop is just as important as doing enough. No lawyer wants every last case on a topic when every last case says exactly the same thing as the first case. How far to go? It's no use looking at legislation if you haven't looked at the regulation, which may make a very big difference in the way material is interpreted. Are you going to know that what's in print is the most recent? Is the internet reliable? Should you be going to CD-ROM? And so as we move through these changes, doing research is not nearly as straightforward as it was. Very often, lawyers don't have time to keep up with the new formats, with the new ways of doing research. And so more and more, that is falling onto librarians and to some degree to law clerks as well. And so we need to know where we're going. We need to be sure how far we should go. where we draw the line. In other words, when is it no longer information that you're giving and when is it legal opinion? Because soon as you cross that bar and you move into giving an opinion rather than providing all the information, you put yourself in a position where there's a liability issue. And that is very difficult because very often there's a very thin line between information and giving an opinion. Some people even feel when you're making choices between what to include and what to exclude, you're using opinion in some degree. Because if you're not giving an opinion, how do you know that what you've left out wasn't the thing that was important? And so those are topics that we can't answer, but you do need to think about. And you need to establish with your principals where they want you to draw the line. So you're expected to find the law, but you're not expected to interpret the law. Now, when the presentations are given, Jeanette and Theresa have indicated that they would like you to interrupt and ask the questions because then they know where your thought processes are, and it's very hard to save a question to the end when the issue they were covering is long gone. So please feel free. It works better if it's sort of more of a dialogue. And with that very short introduction, I'm going to hand over to my two colleagues. On the far left is Theresa Ross. Theresa is the head of the reference service of the Great Library, and she has written papers, given lots of talks, and is an expert on legal research. And next to her is Jeanette Bosschart, who is actually becoming our teaching faculty within the Great Library. She's doing a lot of courses for articling students, for lawyers, and so on, and she is one of our reference librarians. So I'm going to leave you in their capable hands, and I hope to see you later on, and I hope you find your day fruitful. Thank you.
I'm going to clip the old, has to go on this way. Let's see if this is working. Can anybody hear me? Everybody hear me? As Janine so graciously put it, I have done talks for lawyers, law clerks, students, never in such numbers though, so bear with me if I only look at a few of you. I only do about 10 usually. I've been asked to speak to you about legislative research. Now your program somewhere says that this is to be a comprehensive overview, and that is certainly an ambitious goal. I don't think in the time we have that I'm going to reach it, but I will endeavor to do my best to take you through the key sources, the key techniques for finding and updating statutes and regs. I'd like to begin by just going over what we mean by when we talk about legislation. Legal materials are divided into two types of sources. There are primary sources, which constitute the law themselves, and secondary sources, which they provide commentary on the law, or they serve as finding tools to the law. Legislation falls in the first category. It is one of the two main types of primary sources. The other type being case law, which my colleague Theresa will cover in the next session. Case law is law made by judges, and legislation is essentially law made by governments. In Canada's federal system, there are many governments, and legislation comes from many sources, various levels of government, mainly from the federal parliament and from all the provincial and territorial legislatures. We even have a new legislature, Nunavut, which, as far as I understand, has passed one piece of legislation so far, a Flag Act. So that's all expanding. Municipal governments produce primary law as well. They produce law in the form of bylaws, and that's also considered legislation. It's our Constitution Act of 1867 that actually sets out which levels of government can make which laws. It divides all the areas of law and gives it to the various jurisdictions. In general terms, provincial legislatures may legislate on such matters as property, family law, education, health, provincial incorporation of companies, and everything not exclusively designated as a provincial jurisdiction becomes a federal jurisdiction. That's what our Constitution Act says. So the federal government makes laws in areas that cover the whole country, whether they're programs or other things. So postal services, shipping, defense, incorporation of federal companies, those all fall within the federal jurisdiction. Despite the division of powers set up in the Constitution, however, you'll find that there are many areas of overlap, many gray areas where all levels of government are passing some type of legislation. Some of the overlap areas, examples are taxation, corporations, pensions, natural resources, environment. You know that there's often conflicts between Ontario's environmental laws and the federal environmental laws. So there are definite areas of overlap and definite areas where it's gray as to who actually can pass legislation. So this is one of the primary preliminary considerations that you have when you are conducting legislative research, and that's the matter of jurisdiction. Is the topic that you're researching, is that a matter of federal jurisdiction? Are federal laws passed on this topic, or is it provincial? That question is often answered because it's a simple answer. It's a matter of common knowledge. For example, a criminal matter would fall under federal criminal law. But there are lots of other areas. Say you had a problem on expropriation, where would that fall? If you're unsure of that, and most of us are when we start in a particular area, the easiest thing to do is to do a little preliminary research, to go to a secondary source, a general secondary source, such as a textbook on your topic, a loose leaf service that contains legislation as well. You'll find that most good textbooks on a topic will have a table of statutes in the beginning. They'll have an introduction, a table of cases, and they'll often have a table of statutes. So you can see right there whether the law is provincial or federal. You can also use, which is a really good source for conducting or beginning any kind of legislative research, and that's the CED, the Canadian Encyclopedic Digest. Are most of you familiar with that source? It's a big multi-volume set in print. It also comes in as a CD-ROM, and it provides you with summaries of current law divided up into topics, and it always gives you references to the relevant legislation in an area. So it's very handy. It also cross-references legislation, so it'll give you, if it's a provincial jurisdiction, it'll give you the Ontario law, and it usually has a footnote and tells you what, say, Alberta law is in this area as well. So it's a good place to start that type of research. I'd like to start now by talking specifically about the two main types of legislation that we use, statutes and regulations. We usually say statutes, and sometimes we say acts. So when I use the two terms interchangeably, they're basically the same. I'm going to start with statutes, and then at the end, hopefully we'll have time, I'll cover regulations. I'm going to concentrate mainly on federal and Ontario materials, but many of the sources that I mentioned and the techniques that I discussed, they are applicable to most of the other Canadian jurisdictions, so the other provinces, if you needed to do research with them. As we go along, I'll also discuss the different media that the materials come in, whether it's print, CD-ROM, an online database, or the internet, because as Janine mentioned, there's an awful lot of choice these days. And as we go, I'll try and give you the pros and cons of the different media. And I'd also, if you have any questions, please ask them as we're going, because we're going to cover a lot, and it's sometimes hard to remember what it was you wanted to ask the question about later. In order to conduct effective legislative research, I've always felt it's very essential to have some understanding of the process by which statutes are enacted. So I'd like to try and start with the flow chart you've got on page 1 of your materials, and that's how Ontario public bills become law. This up here. It's nice and blurry. I'm going to discuss Ontario, but the basics of how bills become law are the same for the other provinces and for the federal government as well, except, as I'll mention later, there's some extra steps in the federal government. There are actually two types of bills. There are public bills and private bills. Their main difference is a matter of scope. Public bills are those which the government passes, which are there to implement their policy and which affect all Ontario citizens. So they affect the general public. Private bills and private acts are those which affect a narrow scope, so a smaller group of the Ontario citizens. It can be a corporation, it can be a charity, a hospital, a municipality. Those are the types of things that are covered by private bills or acts. We're not going to be looking at those in this session, but I just want you to know that they are there as well. But we're going to be concentrating on public bills. All bills need to go through 3 readings and receive royal assent before they become acts. In Ontario, a bill is introduced for first reading. The minister makes a statement at that time. He says why the government is introducing the bill. And the bill is put on the agenda and it's scheduled for further debate for second reading. At first reading, the bill is also printed and distributed. So that's your first reading version of a bill comes at that stage. Second reading is where a bill is debated in usually fairly lengthy terms in the legislature when all the parties get in and they debate the bill. It is, at this stage, if a bill is passed, they take a vote, and if the bill is passed, it moves on to the next stage, and that is called the committee stage. Very rarely, and it does happen on occasion, a bill will go straight from second reading down to third reading. This happens when it's a very uncontentious bill or it's something that's extremely politically correct and there's no party that wants to be seen as being against it. So it can happen, but usually what happens is it goes to committee. It generally ends up in a standing committee. And standing committees are committees where the public can appear and they can make submissions at the hearings. So that's when you get public groups making submissions on various bills. That's a standing committee. If the standing committee decides they want to amend the bill, then it's reported back. And if it is amended, then another version of the bill is printed. Next, a committee can go to something called Committee of the Whole House. And this has a strange name, but what it actually means is that the legislature sits as a whole as a committee. So everybody gets to take part in there. The public does not appear at those committees. It's just in the legislature itself. Again, if the bill is amended, it's reprinted again. So you have to keep in mind, if you were doing bill research, that the version of the bill you have by this stage could be quite different than the version of the bill you have at first reading. It could have incorporated quite a few amendments by now. And what's also sometimes confusing is they renumber the sections on you as they go along. Eventually, the bill comes back for third reading in the legislature, and this is a fairly fast process, so really no more amendments added. It's voted on, and if the bill passes, it is sent to the Lieutenant Governor for royal assent. Royal assent is largely a symbolic process. This is where our Lieutenant Governor at the moment, Hilary Weston, in her Holt Renfrew suit, agrees to the bill on the part of the Queen. This is also the stage where a bill matures. A bill is no longer a bill after royal assent. It is now an act. And because it's an act, it gets a chapter number. It gets a chapter number for the next annual volume of statutes. And the bill is reprinted one more time, showing the statutes. It's say Statutes of Ontario 1999, Chapter 30 will appear underneath the bill number. So now you know that your bill has become an act. Now, a bill may be an act, it may be law, but it's not necessarily in force. And this is a very important distinction, becoming more and more important these days, because bills rarely come into force as they did in the good old days on royal assent. Nowadays, the coming into force provisions are very complicated sometimes. So just keep in mind that your bill your act at royal assent is law, but it may not be in force. It may not actually be working yet. They haven't kind of turned on the switch on it yet. And we'll be dealing with the coming into force of acts a little bit later. The new act will be included in the next annual volume of statutes, the Ontario Statutes of Ontario. And eventually, maybe 10 years from now, well actually our last revision was 1990, so the new revision should be coming up soon. The annual statutes are included in the revised statutes. So your bill will go from the annual statutes. Eventually, if it's still around, if it hasn't been repealed in the meantime, it will be consolidated into the revised statutes of Ontario. Does anybody have any questions about, this is a kind of overview, not too detailed, but an overview of how a bill becomes an act. Now that we've seen the stages that a statute goes through, I'd like to familiarize you a little bit with the forms of citation that are used to identify the legislation at the various stages. And you'll find some examples of citing legislation on page 2 of your materials. This is just the same thing here. Okay, we're going to try and take out regs for now. For bills, any province's bills, you need a number of elements. You need your bill number in a cite, you need the title of the bill, but you absolutely need to put in the session, the province, so the jurisdiction, and the year. There is nothing worse, and I'm sure you've probably gone through something like this. Someone says they want Bill 3. Well, that could be Bill 3 from any recent session. The bill numbers are used over and over again, and it could actually be Bill 3 from any province. So try and get whoever gives you the information, or if you are passing on information, try and give as much information as you can, otherwise, you know, it gets hard. But these are all complete citations, and the more you work with citations and you recognize citations, the better you will get at deciphering them and finding them, even if you do get incomplete information or incorrect information. Federal bills are a little different. You don't need to put the jurisdiction in for federal bills because the federal bill number itself indicates to you, should indicate to you automatically that it's a federal bill. And the reason for this is it has a letter designation there. And the letter designation tells you which house of the federal government this bill originated in. So Bill S-10 is a Senate bill because you see the S. So that's a bill that originated in the Senate. Bill C-42, that's a House of Commons bill. It originated in the House of Commons. One thing I forgot to mention when we looked at the bills chart is I said I was going to just tell you about federal bills. Federal bills carry on just the way Ontario bills do, except that they have an extra step because they have an extra house to go through. So a House of Commons bill will do 3 readings in the House of Commons, and then it will go to the Senate and do 3 readings there, and then it will receive royal assent. So it just has a little further to travel, but it does basically the same thing. Annual statutes are fairly easy, the citations. SO stands, of course, for Statutes of Ontario, SC, Statutes of Canada, and so on. Again, you need the name of the act, and hopefully you'll be given the chapter number. If not, you just turn to the table of contents of the year that you are given, and you can find the act there. Revised statutes, again, are fairly straightforward. Your R indicates to you immediately that this is the revised statutes of Ontario you're dealing with. We sometimes have confusion. In Ontario, you'll get a cite to an act that says SO 1990. And that just means it's the Statutes of Ontario 1990, the annual red volume rather than the revision. The federal statutes, the chapter number is alphanumeric. Actually, it is for Ontario too. An alphanumeric chapter number, so a C3 or a Z5, that indicates to you, should indicate to you immediately that's a revised statutes. Because as we, statutes, when they go into a revision, are alphabetically arranged, and so they can number them with letters of the alphabet. Makes it a lot easier to find it. And in the annual volumes, they're arranged just by the number of the chapter number. But again, in the revision, they go in and they're arranged alphabetically. And that's why you get alphanumeric chapter numbers for federal and Ontario revised statutes. And regulations we're going to leave till later. So now that you should be able to identify almost any site that they throw at you, let's talk about finding the actual legislation. The next couple of pages in your booklet here provide you with lists of sources for bills and for statutes, and I'd just like to go over that a little bit and show you the different formats that bills come in and the different sources you can use. Starting with Ontario. Ontario bills are of course available in print, and they're available on QL, and they are now available on the internet on the Ontario Legislative Assembly's website. Both of the electronic sources are very good. They're quite current. On the Legislative Assembly websites, they post bills that have been introduced at first reading. They're up approximately 2 days after they've been introduced, which is really quite good. Our library subscribes to the paper as well, of course, and it takes a little longer for the paper copies to arrive. So if you have heard or someone has told you that there's a new amendment to the Franchise Act going through, you can easily look on the Legislative Assembly website and you can find it there pretty quickly, even if it's only been a couple of days ago that it got first reading. The advantage, of course, of the website as well is that it is free. In the event that you need the official version of a bill, however, you need to work with the paper. The paper bills produced by the government are the only official versions of the bill. The other time you will probably need to use the paper bills is if you're doing any kind of historical research, if you need to look for bills from a previous session, a few sessions back. Because as you can see, Quick Law and the internet site, they provide archives to the previous session's bill, but that doesn't take you back very far. And let's say you were asked to find a bill from about 4 years ago or 5 years ago, you wouldn't find it there. And the other thing, of course, with electronic sources is there's no guarantee that these archives will continue to exist. It's very likely that for space reasons or other reasons, they will just be dropped and there will be no record left of it. So libraries such as ours and other large libraries, we maintain historical collections of printed bills. Ours go back to the 1800s. So we will always have the print copy, and you may need that if you have to look for an older bill. Federal bills are in much the same formats and the same sources. The only difference being, of course, there are 2 sets of bills in every session. There are your Senate bills and your House of Commons bills. The parliamentary internet site that the federal government has put up is an extremely good site. It's well organized, very current. It's fairly easy to access and find your way around in. And of course, it's free. QL also has current bills up, and they also have progress tables for both their Ontario bills and their federal bills. And this will be very handy because it tells you at what stage the bill is at. That's also available actually on the internet sites. And we'll get into that a little later. Other jurisdictions, we get the paper bills from other jurisdictions in the library, but a lot of them are also now, the current bills are available on the internet. And at the bottom of the page there, I've included a site for you. This is one of many, but it's considered a very good gateway site. If you go into what's called the Access to Justice Network, or ACJNet, you'll find a button there for legislative materials. If you select that, you'll get a very comprehensive list of legislative materials from all the Canadian jurisdictions. So it's a good place to go if you need a current BC bill, something like that. You can access it through that without having to know all the different addresses or URLs for all the different legislatures. Moving on to statutes, you'll find sources for statutes on the next 2 pages. There are both official and unofficial sources for statutes. For now, at least, the printed statutes, those printed by the governments, are the only official sources. There are rumors about changes to the Evidence Act and various other amendments that may at some point allow us to have official sources that are electronic, but as far as it stands right now, the printed statutes are your only official source. For Ontario, these are the annual red-bound volumes of the Statutes of Ontario and the large blue set, the Revised Statutes of Ontario 1990. These are the statutes that you cite to. These are the statutes that you refer to in any kind of legal proceedings. These are the statutes that have the force of law. The primary finding tools for official sources are included in the back of the Statutes of Ontario, the annual bound volumes. The very last volume at the back, there are a series of tables. And the table that you'll be using most, and that is your best bet for updating anything up to the end of 98 in any case, is called the Table of Public Statutes, and it is found at the back of that volume. This is where you would go if you know the name of an act, but you need the site. It's the easiest place to go for that. Yes?
If there's a short name,
Mm-hmm.
how is it listed?
The Table of Public Statutes lists statutes by their short title. Almost all statutes have a short title and a long title. A long title is what is at the very top of the statute when you see it. And somewhere within the body of the statute, you'll see a section in the margin. It says short title. And there they will give you the short title, the title that you use to find it with and that you use to cite it with. And those are how it's listed in the Table of Public Statutes, short title. Right. Any other questions? The unofficial sources of statutes are those that are published commercially. Now, examples are things like, we're all familiar with the handy-dandy one-volume annual annotated statutes. These are unofficial. They're produced by legal publishers. A statute in a CCH loose-leaf service is an unofficial source, or a statute on QL as well. Now, governments themselves produce unofficial sources. The Ontario government produces print consolidations of its statutes and the statutes that it puts up on its website. Those are unofficial statutes, and it'll tell you in the introduction that these are unofficial, and if there's any dispute or any legal proceedings, you refer to the paper. The reality is that in conducting legislative research these days, we rely very heavily, of course, on the unofficial versions of legislation. And these versions typically provide us with a consolidated act, that is an act which incorporates all the recent amendments, so that we're working with a fairly up-to-date version of an act. They're very convenient. They also provide us with other value-added things. The annotated acts, of course, provide you with relevant legislation, relevant case law under the various sections, as well as other commentary, notes about the amendments, that type of thing. So the publisher has added to the act the things that he or she thinks would be of interest to researchers and added that in. So we find these very useful, plus they give us some value-added information. They also provide us with a lot better subject access. Unofficial sources is where we go if we need to find a statute by subject. Subject access to the Statutes of Ontario and the revision is essentially non-existent. It is not very good. What indexes there are, paper indexes there are really too general for legislative research. So we rely really heavily on the indexes that come with the annotated acts, and of course the electronic sources which give you keyword access to legislation. So for subject searching, you really do have to rely on the unofficial consolidations. Another advantage of the unofficial consolidations is that they often include regulations, forms, rules, that type of thing in the same package. So in one place you can find the various types of legislation to do with one act. They're handy for that as well. The two most popular formats are really the annotated act and the consolidated act that Canada Law Book, Carswell's, Butterworth's produces now, and they produce them annually. I'd like to go over the difference between a consolidated act and an annotated act. The annotated act is the one that has the value added, and the consolidated act, it just gives you the act with all the recent amendments incorporated. In some cases, you will just want the consolidated act. You may just be looking at a section and you don't need all the extra material that comes with it. In other cases, you really do want that extra material, and then an annotated act is your best bet. As with everything that's handy-dandy and convenient, it comes with certain caveats, and I would just like to mention 3 of them to you, okay? Number 1, this says it's a 1999 annotated Ontario Highway Traffic Act. Anyone you know what this is up to date to? Not 1999 by any means. Never go by the title. Look in the introduction or the preface to the act to make sure that you know what it's up to date to. Typically, these are up to date to midway through the previous year, so always keep that in mind. They're not as up to date as the title leads you to believe. The other thing that you have to know about these is you shouldn't become too reliant on them, because these are produced for acts that will sell. So you will find annotations and consolidations of popular acts. So if you become too used to them, you'll start looking for things like the annotated Abandoned Orchards Act and you'll be severely disappointed because you will have to do it the official way. So it's good to know the official way as well. Lastly, always bear in mind that these are commercial products. They're produced by people who can make mistakes and who do. And if you rely on these, you have no leg to stand on, because you should know that you cannot rely on these blindly. It's always a good idea to check another source if you have a question or you think that perhaps with the information that they gave you in here about coming into force or something like that doesn't look quite right. Always go check it in another source. So just always bear in mind that it may contain mistakes. And those are my caveats for the handy-dandy annotated acts. As well as the print consolidations, you've got on your list there are of course electronic consolidations. There are currently 2 CD-ROM products on the market for Ontario legislation, one produced by Canada Law Book, the other one produced by the government. In my experience, CD-ROMs allow you the best subject searching. The search engines that are on the CD-ROMs that come with the Folio software that are what run the CD-ROMs, they provide the best subject access. The QL and LexisNexis, the online databases, they provide, I would say, the second best subject access. And the internet provides very rudimentary. The search engines that come with these sites, these internet sites, are not the greatest, and they sometimes lead to very confusing results. They work sometimes, but they're not as good as the CD-ROM. The Ontario Citator service is actually based on the paper Ontario Citator. The big difference is that the CD-ROM gives you the full text of statutes and regulations, not just the amendments. It has certain advantages over the government-produced CD-ROM, which is also a good product. However, the government one tends to be less up-to-date than the Citator. And the Citator also gives you some annotation. Not a lot, but it does give you some cases under sections, which the other one does not. QL, of course, has various databases with statutes for Ontario, federal, and some of the other provinces. They have really improved their legislative coverage, and they've brought it quite up to date now. LexisNexis is the newcomer in this field. It's a large American online vendor, and it's just started to add Canadian content to their databases. They are, however, much more expensive than QL. Now, maybe competition will even things out a bit, but as it stands now, it's more expensive. Just turning the page to the federal sources for statutes, you'll see that they are really much the same, and almost everything that I've said about their Ontario counterparts holds true here as well. Again, we have official sources, the unofficial ones, two CD-ROM services, again, one produced by Canada Law Book based on the Canada Citator, and one produced by the government, by the federal government in this case. You'll find, of course, that the government CD-ROMs and the government internet sites provide you with bilingual statutes. So if you ever have to look for a French version or French definition, something like that, you can use these sources, and they provide hyperlinks from the English directly to the French. Again, at the bottom of the page, I've included the ACJNet site, simply because, again, you can look at their list of legislative materials and go to some of the other provinces and territories that have their statutes up on the net. Not all of them do by any means so far, but everybody's working on it, and so as they come up, they will be included in that list. Does anybody have any questions before I move to updating? Of course, after finding all your relevant legislation, you're left with the most important stage of legal research, and that is updating. No matter what format or what source you use, you will need to update, because there is not a single source out there that is completely up to date. Your piece of legislation could be amended by a small piece in a recent bill, or it could be amended because a proclamation, part of an act came into force, received proclamation, and added a change to your act. So you must always, always update. Even if you think you've got a fairly up-to-date consolidation of an act, you still need to update. Page 6 there outlines the principal steps for updating Ontario statutes. Using official sources, you would find your act in the revised statutes of Ontario 1990, and then you would use the table of public statutes found in the last annual volume to find any amendments to the end of that year. That is the basic official way of updating your statutes. It's a good thing once in a while to just go out and practice that, because in the event that the other sources aren't available, or the other sources are faulty or incorrect in some way, you need to have this as your fallback strategy. You need to be able to do this. You probably won't use it much anymore, but you need to know it's there. The table of public statutes is your most authoritative updating tool. It won't take you right to the current moment, but it's the most authoritative thing you can use to the end of 1998. The statutes, as I mentioned, are listed alphabetically in there by their short title. You'll find a cite to the revised statutes of Ontario 1990, and then you'll find all your amendments up to the end of 1998. Unfortunately, Ontario is one of the jurisdictions that doesn't break down those amendments by section. They don't tell you which section of your act those amendments affect. And so it does take a little work. You have to go look up those individual amendments and see if they affect your section. You'll find a lot of the other provinces are slightly more sophisticated, and they'll list the section numbers there, and you can tell at a glance if you need to check amendments or not. Unfortunately, Ontario makes you work at it, and you have to go check all the individual amendments. That's the official way. If you're using an unofficial consolidation, the first thing you do is find out what it's up to date to. You need to know from what date forward you need to do your updating. All of them somewhere, some of them it's harder to find than others, but all of the unofficial sources, print or electronic, somewhere should tell you what that material is current to. In the annotated and consolidated acts, you should check the preface or the introduction, because the editor will tell you. In the CD-ROM products, they tell you, usually it comes at the top of the screen in a reference box, updated to. You definitely pay attention to that. And QL has the scope notes for all their databases, will tell you exactly what the latest information is up to date to. So start by finding that out, and then continue your updating. You may find that you don't have to do much dating at all, but you need to know your starting point. Your next step is going to be to find amending bills, to find current bills that may affect your section. They may not have been passed yet. They may still be in the works, but you'd like to be alerted to the fact that a change is coming down. You need to check the bills. There are two types of bills when you're doing this kind of checking. Some bills are very simple bills, an act to amend the Condominium Act. You know, if you're updating the Condominium Act, that's a bill you're going to need to look at. The trickier types of bills are what are called omnibus bills, and these are bills that amend a variety of different statutes. And in the past number of years, we've seen some enormous omnibus bills go through, bills that have amended 40 and up statutes. And so these are the ones that you cannot tell from the title of the bill that they affect your statute. You have to find some other way to find out. There may be a Tenant Protection Act that makes a small but significant change to your Condominium Act, but it's embedded in that bill and you have to find it. In that case, you can read through all the current bills. You could read through them all from beginning to end and see if they affect your section, but that's a rather onerous task, and I don't know anybody that does that. This is where we rely on some of the secondary sources that I've listed in step 3 for you. A very good one is produced by Carswell. It's a small loose leaf bound booklet or a binder, and it's called the Ontario Legislative Digest. It has a tab that's called Titles Affected, or Titles Affected? I think it's Titles Affected. And you would look under the name of your act, and it would indicate to you, it'll alert you to any bills which as a whole or in part amended your act or are in the process of amending your act. So that's a good place to look. There's also Canadian Current Law. This is a booklet that comes with the Canadian abridgment, and it does the entire country. So if you needed to find whether an Alberta Act is being amended by a new Alberta bill, this is a place you would go. It has a very good table called Statutes Amended, Repealed, or Proclaimed. It's not quite as current, say, as the Ontario Legislative Digest service, but it does serve a good function like that as well. So after you've identified the bills that may affect your statute or do affect your statute, the last and final step, and becoming the most complicated step these days, is finding out whether these amending pieces of legislation are in force. There are actually 3 ways that an Ontario statute can come into force. The Act can come into force on royal assent. That means the day it receives royal assent. And that used to be the preferred method of coming into force. An Act can come into force on a day that is specified. The Act itself may give you a date. It can be a future date or a retroactive date, but it'll actually tell you the date within the statutes. That's one of the fast, easy ways. The last, and unfortunately for us legal researchers, the most popular, is by proclamation. Proclamation means that the effective date of the Act will be decided by Cabinet. And once they've made a decision, they will send it to the Lieutenant Governor. She will approve it, and then it'll be printed in the Ontario Gazette. So the place where you find proclamations officially is the Ontario Gazette. They're usually one of the first things. They're not hidden at the back or anything. They're usually the cover page and the first couple of pages inside it. That's where you find proclamations bringing acts into force. The section of the Act that tells you which of these 3 methods it is using is called the commencement section. And in Ontario bills and acts, the commencement section is usually found near the end of the Act. Actually, it's usually the second last section of the Act. The last section of the Act in Ontario Act is your short title section, tells you the short title. The second last section generally tells you when or in what way the Act comes into force. However, in recent years, you've seen this particular government passing enormous pieces of legislation. They're so big that usually they're divided into parts or schedules. And they have now taken to putting commencement sections, separate commencement sections for each part or schedule. So you may have to take your bill and really take a good look through it. It may not actually show at the end what the commencement section is of the individual parts. You may have to look at the end of Part 1 or the end of Schedule B, and it may have a different commencement section. So you should check those things out. So you have to be careful. So the official way of checking for proclamations, because that's what you'll probably need to do, is to find the table called the Table of Proclamations again at the back of the annual volume of statutes. It's in with all those tables at the back. There's one called the Table of Proclamations. You could look there under the name of your act and just see whether it has received a proclamation. And then, because it only takes to the end of 1998, officially you would look through all the issues of the Ontario Gazette subsequent to that. Now, unfortunately, at this time of year, that requires you to look through approximately 5-6 months worth of gazettes, and there's not many of us who have the time to do that. So again, this is where we rely on the secondary sources. Most of the sources that give you status of legislation or progress of bills tables will give you proclamation dates. QL has a very good progress of bills table on their database. It's very current. They index the Gazette weekly. The Ontario Legislative Digest Service that I mentioned for finding bills that affect your act, it also tells you the stage your bill is at and will give you proclamation dates. Probably the most important new development is that the Ontario Legislative Assembly website has added a new section called Proclamations, and you can access it through the address that I've put there. You just select Proclamations. It is very up to date, and it gives you all your acts by short title. It actually takes you back to 1986, I believe, and gives you all the proclamations right to the current, to the Gazette. If you aren't using that source, but you're using a secondary source, you still need to usually see whether a Gazette has been issued that week, and maybe check 1 or 2 issues of that just to make sure you're completely up to date. But the Ontario Legislative Assembly site, it's free, and they've really done a good job. It's really great to see that. Okay, so to recap briefly, updating statutes. Step 1 is you consolidate your act. Either you use the table of public statutes and look for the amendments and incorporate the amendments into your act. You either do it yourself or you rely on a commercially produced product where the publisher has done that for you. Step 2 is to check for bills that affect your act or parts of bills that affect your act. Step 3 is to see whether these amending bills are actually in force. So you need to read through and find out what method the bill is using, and if it needs a proclamation, that's step 4, to find the proclamation. Anybody have any questions? Yes?
With respect to finding current bills that affect your act, is there any other source available? For instance, the Ontario Legislative Digest Service, that's
Yep.
paper.
Yeah, it is.
Is it by Carswell?
Yes, it is.
Carswell has a service on the internet now called eCarswell.
Yes.
Do they have that service available?
That's a very good question. We have not had a good look at eCarswell yet, and I do not know. Theresa, do you know?
No, I don't know.
I suspect, and I could be wrong, and I will certainly check it out for you, I suspect that they do not. And the reason I'm saying that is that, as far as I understand eCarswell, it is like they have CD-ROM products out called their Partners series, and these are kind of hybrid sources which have text, case law, and legislation. They are more a textual thing than a bills tracking thing. And I don't think that they would be up to date enough to include that, unfortunately. This is one of the hardest things, is checking for bills, because you need a source that has done an awful lot of work. You need a source where someone has read through all the bills, literally, and input that information. And there really aren't that many sources that do that. Now, if you're really up on an area, if you read all the newsletters and you say condominium law, you know that there's an amendment coming, then you'll be aware of it. But if you're into a new area of law, you are going to have to use one of these service centers. And yes, it is in paper, and I don't know of any that does that value-added thing in electronic form right now, unless you can think of.
No, I actually don't know any source, but eCarswell is a fairly new product, and the publisher hasn't quite decided what's going to be in it. So this would be a good opportunity for you to contact Carswell and say, I pay a lot for this service. I'd like this on it. You might consider something like that.
Very good. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. If there are any questions, I'm going to move on to the second type of legislation that we are dealing with this morning, and that's regulations. Regulations are what provide the necessary detail to make an act, the broad provisions of an act, work. For example, the Day Nurseries Act provides for the licensing and administration of daycare centers. It's the regulations which stipulate how many child care workers are required for children of different ages. It tells you the lighting specifications and the minimum dimensions for rooms. That's the type of detail that you will find in regulation. Regulations are the nuts and bolts that make the statutes work. As another example, can anybody tell me if we have photo radar in Ontario? Yes, no? Come on, somebody must know. No, you're right, we don't. We haven't had photo radar in Ontario since 1995. However, if you go to check the Ontario Highway Traffic Act, you will see that the photo radar provisions are still in the Act. They have not been repealed. So how did they do that? I'll tell you. What they did is they took the regulation that was made under that Act that designates areas of the province where photo radar can be used, and they revoked it. So since there are no designated areas in Ontario for photo radar, there is no photo radar. So by revoking a regulation, they have effectively disabled a provision of the Ontario Highway Traffic Act. So regulations are very powerful, and they should never be overlooked. That's the moral of the story. When you are doing legislative research and you find relevant statute law, you should automatically, not stop there, but you should automatically go and see if there are regulations made under that act. Regulations are often referred to as subordinate legislation, and that's just really a fancy word for term for saying that regulations are made under what's called an enabling statute. It's a statute that enables the regulation to have force of law. Regulations cannot stand on their own. They derive their power from a statute. Now, statute may have any number of regulations, from dozens of them to none at all, and some statutes have very big regulations. They can be massive. The Ontario Building Code Act itself is something like 3 pages long, but its one and only regulation, the Ontario Building Code, is hundreds of pages long. So as they say, the devil is in the details, so check your regulations. Unlike statutes, regulations are not passed or debated in the legislature. There's really very little public scrutiny on regulations. They are basically drafted by ministry staff, then they're approved by cabinet, then they go to something called the Registrar of Regulations, where they're filed, and then they are printed in the Ontario Gazette. Federal regulations are printed in the Canada Gazette Part 2, and most of I think all of the other provinces and territories have gazettes, and that's where their regulations are printed as well. Regulations are similar to statutes in that they are periodically consolidated. In Ontario, this happens approximately every 10 years, and so it coincides with statute revisions. That's why we have the RSO 1990 and the RRO, the Revised Regulations of Ontario 1990. We are actually lucky because some provinces don't consolidate their regulations at all, and the federal regulations have not been consolidated officially since 1978. So we should consider ourselves lucky. Most large libraries like ours take the regulations that appear in the Ontario Gazette, and at the end of the year we bind those together with the annually issued table of regulations. So in libraries like ours, you'll see we make annual volumes of regulations, but officially there really are no annual volumes of regulations. There are just loose issues of the Ontario Gazette. The table of regulations, just like the table of public statutes, is your best finding and updating tool for regulations if you're doing it the official way. It's published twice a year, actually, so it's better than the table of public statutes. And it's cumulative from the last revision of regulations, so it's cumulative from 1990. It's organized by enabling statutes, so you need to know the statute, the name of the statute that your regulation was made under, and then you would look under that statute, and there you would find a list of the various regulations. You'd find their site in the Revised Regulations of Ontario 1990, if they were around then, and then you'll find regulation numbers for all the amending regulations. Let's see. Usually occasionally when you update a statute, you will find that there are actually no amendments. You're never this lucky when you update regulations, because regulations take care of the details. They do fees, forms, specs, all that kind of thing. They're often, well, they're continuously amended and revoked. So it's really essential that you update, and it's also a place where we rely again on unofficial consolidations to update, just because they will incorporate all this massive change that happens to regulations. If you look on, actually, just before I forget, we're just going to turn back to our citation page, because I said that I would do the regs when I got to it. So if we can turn back to page 2, and I'll find my thing here. Just have a look at how regs are cited before we go any further. Ontario regulations, it's optional whether you include the name of the regulation in a cite to the reg. Personally, I prefer that people put it in because I find it easier in case they make a mistake with another part of it. I like having the name of the reg, but in the actual rules, it's optional. OREG, of course, stands for Ontario Regulation. These are the numbers and the abbreviation numbers you'll see running at the tops of the pages in the Ontario Gazette. The number there means that this was the 194th regulation filed in the year 1998. That's how you read that number. For the revised regulations, it's again, the name of the regulation is optional, and you don't need to put OREG. You can just put reg because the O is already in the RRO. So you can just put reg and then the regulation number. For Canada, for the federal regulations, you'll see a curious abbreviation, SOR, and that stands for Statutory Orders and Regulations. That's the abbreviations that you'll see running along the tops of the pages in the Canada Gazette. So that's Statutory Orders and Regulations, if anybody asks you and you need to impress them. Here the numbers are reversed a little. The 96 stands for the year, 1996, and the filing number is 332. If you do need to cite to the old consolidation of federal regulations, the CRC, so that stands for Consolidated Regulations of Canada, you don't need to put in the year 1978. That's considered that's our last revision of regulations, so everybody supposedly knows it's 1978. The regs in that consolidation you do need to put the title down for, and they're actually referred to as chapters, and that's why you'll see a small c there, chapter 397. Okay, that's the... All of these citations and the rules for them, they come basically from a standard manual. Theresa, can I just... You're probably familiar with this. This is the standard, most accepted manual of Canadian legal citation. It's officially called the Canadian Guide to Uniform Legal Citation. Usually it's referred to as the McGill Guide because it's produced partially by the University at McGill. But this is the book that if you had you wanted to interpret a statute or you weren't sure how to cite something, get your hands on this volume here, and it gives you all the rules and it gives you examples so you can see how they're all set out if you need things further than this here. Okay, back to regs here. All right, if we turn to page 7, the sources for regulations in your material. We've pretty much discussed the official paper sources of regulations. Again, in this case, it's the print sources published by the government. They're only official sources. There are unofficial sources. As I mentioned, you'll sometimes find in these consolidations that they include not only the Act, but also regulations as well. One warning with this is, however, that because regulations are so voluminous, most publishers don't produce them all. They may produce one set of regulations, the most general set of regulations under an Act, but maybe not all the regulations. So don't rely on this to tell you that these are all the regulations under an Act. The publisher may have only included one set of regs. Another thing I've found, particularly with things like the CCH loose leaf services, is that you have to read carefully because it'll say selections. It may not even give you a full regulation. It may just give you parts of the regulation. So you may find bits and pieces in these consolidations. Better consolidations are found in electronic formats because they give you all the regulations. Of course, with the space that you have in that format, you can put them all on. So the two CD-ROM services for Ontario legislation include the full text of current regulations consolidated. The dates that they're consolidated to are listed on there, and they're actually not bad at all. QL also has regulations. They're not terribly current at the moment. They'll probably update that. And LexisNexis contains Ontario regs as well. The Ontario government site at the Ministry of the Attorney General, they put on the regulations as well as the statutes, but again, not that current. I think the CD-ROM would be your best bet here if you wanted consolidation, or if you were lucky and you were working with the paper consolidation that included the reg you wanted. Turning to the federal sources, because the last official consolidation of federal regulations would require you to do about 20 years of updating, it is not a source that we use very often. You may look up an old site in it, but it's not something you're going to go and grab and start from there. Basically, you would use one of the other products that are out there that's electronic. You would use the Canada Statute Citator is very good. The other CD-ROM produced by the government, QL, is actually, the regs are more up to date for the federal jurisdiction than they are for Ontario. And again, the internet site that the government puts up is actually quite good as well. So especially in the federal jurisdiction, you would be relying on unofficial consolidations because the official one is just miles out of date. I have the feeling, and I have heard rumors, that they will never consolidate federal regulations in paper again. They may have to create an official electronic version, but there is just too much out there. Federal regulations are just massive. The regulations under the Food and Drug Act alone would be a volume. The one thing that, it's just a small point, but sometimes this comes up, the one thing that only the paper will have are some of the diagrams that come with regulations. I have found on occasion, it was actually the Shipping Act, a regulation was to contain a diagram of a boat, a hull of a boat, and it was not on the CD-ROM. I had to use the paper for that. So just keep that in mind. Some of them, the CD-ROM and the electronic, don't reproduce the actual schematic diagrams. Just a small point. One thing I'd like to bring to your attention is at the bottom, or near the bottom of the page there, under Internet, under the federal sources, you'll see the Canada Gazette. And this is a recent and very helpful addition to the Internet. Issues of the Canada Gazette from 1998 forward have been posted on the Internet. I think it's an experiment, but I think it's working really well, and hopefully they'll keep them there. So you can actually find the Canada Gazette Part 2 issues there from 1998 forward. And this is very helpful if your office or your firm or yourself don't subscribe to the Canada Gazette, don't have a subscription to it. You can actually check for current federal regulations quite easily for free on the Internet. Yes?
It's actually very difficult to download when you give that to print.
That I agree with. That I agree with. It's good for looking. I would use it as I would use a lot of these tools, and that's a very good point, as a method of checking. But to actually get the text, yes, you may just want to run to the library and grab that issue of the Gazette off.
My main focus of practice is trademarks, and they changed
Oh.
the Trademark Act. And I just wanted that little paragraph, because I didn't want the whole law.
Right.
But it was really difficult to
Yeah, yeah. That is the one thing that does come up, that you can find it, but yes, how do you get it off? Yeah. Good point. Some other provinces, not a lot yet, but some have followed the federal government's example, and they have posted their gazettes on the Internet as well. I really wish Ontario would do that, but no word on that at the moment. You can access those other provinces' gazettes, again, through the same place, the ACJNet. As with statutes, regulations need to be amended. So I believe my last overhead here is that the official method for updating regulations, as I mentioned, is you'd use your table of regulations found in the last, actually it's either published with the Gazette, or this is a good tip, if you don't get the Gazette, the table of regulations is actually published along with all those other tables in the back of the bound annual volumes of statutes. That table of regulations is reproduced there. So if you've lost your table of regs that comes with the Gazette, you can find it in the statutes. So you would use the table of regulations there, and then you would update with issues of the Ontario Gazette. Or unofficially, you would use your consolidated version, whether it be print or electronic, making sure you know what the cutoff date is, the date from which you need to start updating, and from that point forward, check issues of the Gazette. So they're very straightforward ways to update regulations, luckily. That about concludes the sources that I wanted to cover with you. There are, as you can see, a great variety of sources and formats, and it's actually a good thing we have that much choice. It gives you alternative sources if you're in a library or you're in a situation where some of them aren't available. It's really good to know that other ones exist. It also gives you a choice. If one you find isn't up to date enough, you can pick another one. I think that over the long haul, we will not lose the paper. I think that, at least for the time being, because it is official, all those sources will need to continue. And I think that even if the internet sources are becoming increasingly important, I think governments have really taken a giant leap here, because they can put this material up for free. And I think you'll see more provinces putting up more material on the internet. The CD-ROMs are still, I think, your best research tool. They're a nice, neat package. They include everything. They're relatively up to date. They have good searching capabilities. Online is becoming, they're putting up more legislative content, but I have to admit personally that online is not the first place I would go for legislative research. I think maybe it will be in the future, but as it stands now, I would still go to other sources first, and I think it's still too expensive to make it the best source. So that's kind of my take on this. Does anybody have any questions? If you think of any, I'm going to be here for the duration, so please feel free to talk to me during the break, or if you think of something later, give me a call. Yes?
I don't know if this is in this context, but when I'm reading different case laws, and from one law firm to another law firm to another law firm, they're cited differently. Some are in italics, some are underlined.
Right.
Is there a format that we are supposed to follow?
Yes, there is a format you're supposed to follow, and I'm actually going to postpone the answer to your question and leave it to Theresa, who is actually going to cover that. So hopefully you'll get your answer there. All right, I think it's break time.